In Central America, a University of Arizona graduate is repairing a water system destroyed by a hurricane 20 years ago.
We are very concerned about accessing safe water to these families in the rural area.
And how do civil wars that started more than 4 decades ago in Central America impact Arizona now?
The United States put itself on the wrong side of history in the 1980s.
I'm Nancy Montoya, in for Lorraine Rivetta. Welcome to this special edition of Arizona Week, Beyond the Headlines from Central America. Now, over the past 4 decades, there have been several major events in Central America that directly impact Arizona. Civil wars in the 1980s, Hurricane Mitch in the 1990s, and most recently this summer, while on a fellowship with the International Women's Media Fund, I was in Honduras. The purpose was to cover the gang and drug cartel violence that has resulted in hundreds of thousands of Central American refugees seeking asylum in the U.S. We began almost 20 years ago with the deadliest hurricane to hit Central America in 200 years. On October 29, 1998, Mitch, a Category 5 hurricane, crashed into Central America. The worst hit, Honduras, with sustained winds of 180 miles per hour for 18 straight hours. It's estimated that more than 20,000 people died. Entire villages in rural areas disappeared. Almost all of the bridges and major roadways in Honduras were destroyed or heavily damaged. 90% of water treatment plants collapsed under floodwaters. Honduras' water supply would be left severely contaminated with no way to provide clean drinking water for 80% of the population. Javier Mayorga was just a teenager when Hurricane Mitch destroyed his family's home and left 25% of all Hondurans homeless.
These families suffer a lot, especially children. They got a lot of stomach infections, because they consume or they drink contaminated water.
It was the images of children dying from dysentery and cholera from drinking contaminated water that inspired him to become part of the solution.
And that was one of the reasons that I really wanted to study something related to this area. So that's why I picked the University of Arizona. I went to school there because they have a good program in watershed management.
We met Mayorga in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, where he is the project coordinator of water and sanitation for World Vision Honduras, a nonprofit organization. 2 decades later, he says, the availability of clean and safe water still remains crippled by Hurricane Mitch and by battles between the cities and the rural communities for the precious commodity. Almost 65% of the people living here are at or below the poverty level. The wealthy and the larger cities get the best and the cleanest water. So NGOs, non-government organizations like World Vision and its collaborator, Water Missions International, and others have concentrated their efforts on those rural areas. North of Tegucigalpa is the small colonia of Las Mercedes. For many homes, water is trucked in. Hundreds of feet of hose lines are laid up steep hills. Barrels are filled. For Juan Pablo and his wife Alicia, 4 days of work equals 2 barrels of water. Without water, he says, there is no life. But this water is not for drinking. Carlos Mejia is an engineer for Water Missions Honduras.
Most of the families have water in their houses. But the main problem is that the water in their houses is contaminated because all the superficial water are contaminated. And that's a hazard for the children, for us as adults, that we can get contaminated water to our system.
In response, a collaboration of NGOs from around the world designed and are building small water purification sites in the rural areas. Each site costs around $60,000 to construct. But once built, it's up to the community members to run and maintain them. David Almendares is in charge of this one. Households pay $10 a month. It would cost 10 times that amount to have bottled water delivered from the city. Even so, women and children were spending 6 hours a day carrying the heavy bottles of water over long distances. So the community decided to create several pickup stations. We made a water depot to make it easier, he says. These depots are located around the community. It is on the honor system. And at this orphanage, children are no longer suffering from dysentery and cholera. A larger water treatment site has been built. The water is not just for the children, but for the entire neighborhood. Pedro Antonio Gonzalez from Nuestros Pequeños Hermanos orphanage makes sure everyone who needs safe water gets it. Communities all around here, he says, now have access to free and safe drinking water. It is a lifesaver.
We are very concerned about the accessing safe water to these families in the rural areas, the poorest and the more vulnerable people in the rural areas of Honduras.
There are now more than 50 of these community purification sites in rural Honduras. Mayorkas says additional resources are still needed from outside of the country to build at least 100 more. Hurricane Mitch was a force of nature. A decade before, though, another force, this one man-made, resulted in more than 1 million refugees fleeing Central America to seek sanctuary in the U.S. Tucson was the birthplace of the sanctuary movement. It started at Southside Presbyterian Church. The Reverend John Fife was the face of an international movement.
It wasn't just me, and it wasn't just individuals. The sanctuary movement was based in entire congregations of churches and synagogues who had to ask the question, if refugees are being captured by government officials and deported back to death squads and massacres of villages and torture, what's our responsibility?
It was a deadly decade, says the Reverend Fife, all in the name of democracy. In the 1970s and 80s, there was growing civil unrest in Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Rich families were being challenged by the impoverished majority. Soviet and Cuban communist influences were aligning themselves with the poor and oppressed. Now, it was at the height of the Cold War, and United States government officials feared the Soviets were ramping up the spread of communism throughout Latin America.
Under the Sandinistas, the people of Nicaragua are suffering from the suppression of civil liberties, suffering materially from a national economy that has collapsed under communist interference and control.
In Guatemala, the wealthy said civil uprisings by peasants and rural indigenous people was backed by communist sympathizers. And so the Guatemalan army, with training and arms support by the U.S. CIA, was dispatched to quash any protests. International human rights groups called them death squads. In 1984, I was in Guatemala and spoke with a family targeted by the death squads for their involvement in anti-government protests and marches. Here's part of that 1984 account. Shortly before the march, Hector Gomez was found dead. His teeth were gone and his tongue had been cut out. His niece, Yolanda Gomez, also an active member of Los Desaparecidos group, identified the body. She says she is convinced her uncle was tortured by military police. I felt like crying and screaming, says Yolanda. All I wanted to do was find out who killed my uncle.
I have been working, researching, writing in Central America since the 1980s.
Elizabeth Oglesby from the University of Arizona's Latin American Center is considered one of the foremost experts on Central America.
And most recently, in 2013, I was an expert witness in the genocide trial against former Army General and Head of State Rios Montt.
In a 1982 coup, General Rios Montt came to power in Guatemala. And while his rule lasted only 18 months, Amnesty International calls it the bloodiest period in the country's 36-year civil war that produced 1 million refugees and 200,000 dead. And in Nicaragua in the 1980s, there were two factions at war: the Sandinistas, who were elected and in power, but with strong ties to communist Cuba and the Soviets. On the other side were the Contras, a far-right group of insurgents, many who were former soldiers, loyal to the dynasty-created government of the powerful U.S.-backed Somoza family.
The government of Nicaragua in the 1980s was trying to implement a different kind of development model for the country, one that could distribute land, that they had a literacy program.
The U.S. government had split loyalties. The executive branch, led by President Ronald Reagan, and a more right-leaning U.S. group of military leaders, believed the communist-linked Sandinistas needed to be removed.
The Reagan administration saw all of that through the lens of the Cold War. So the Reagan administration set about attacking the reformist government of Nicaragua.
The CIA moved in to covertly support the rival Contra-insurgents with training and arms and money. Again, international human rights groups reported that CIA-trained death squads killed tens of thousands of rural peasants, as well as people of faith who stood up to the CIA-backed Contras. In 1985, I reported from Nicaragua that U.S. churches and faith groups were questioning U.S. involvement in Nicaragua.
Recently, some 200 Americans from almost every state in the country, including a delegation from Arizona, traveled to Nicaragua. It was the largest fact-finding mission ever to that region by private citizens.
I guess the basic question I wanted answered was the question of the legitimacy of the Sandinista government.
At the same time, in the mid-1980s, a Democratic-controlled Congress wanted the Reagan administration and the CIA to stop meddling in Central America. Eventually, Congress passed a law prohibiting any money to be used by the CIA to support the Contras. But in a covert deal, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North worked with the CIA to execute a plan to circumvent the intent of Congress and continue funding the Contras by using arms sales to Iran in exchange for money and the release of American hostages. By 1986, the full extent of the Iran-Contra arms deal was revealed. Congressional hearings were held.
Second of all, we were trying to provide a plausibly deniable link directly back to the U.S. government. The effort was made, in other words, so that the hand of the government of the United States was not showing in this action.
In El Salvador, during the same period, another civil war was raging. The U.S. supported the government in El Salvador. Elite families were trying to shut down an uprising of impoverished communities by charging those communities were led by pro-communist factions. According to the international group, the Center for Justice and Accountability, between 1980 and 1992, more than 75,000 civilians died at the hands of government forces. But the Catholic Church in El Salvador came down on the side of the protesters. In 1980, the assassination of Catholic Archbishop Oscar Romero and the rape and murder of 4 American churchwomen caused international outrage. All signs pointed to government forces. And all the while in Honduras in the 1980s, the U.S. turned that country into a staging ground for CIA covert actions towards anti-communist efforts in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. Declassified reports under the Clinton administration from the Council of Foreign Relations concluded that President Ronald Reagan's obsession with stopping the spread of communism in Latin America, no matter the cost, led to great instability in Central America that will last for generations.
The United States put itself on the wrong side of history in the 1980s, and now we are seeing the consequences of that mistaken policy.
The Migration Policy Institute reports indicate that the rise of today's drug cartels and gang violence can be directly linked back to the Reagan years. For the past 3 years, the biggest group of immigrants entering Arizona from Central America are unaccompanied minors. 98% of them are from Honduras, and more than 60% are in Arizona illegally. Those are the statistics. Now we take you beyond the headlines with the story of a then 10-year-old boy caught in the middle of it all. In the 1980s, many families fleeing the U.S.-backed civil wars in Central America made their way to Los Angeles. The U.S. government refused to accept them as refugees and pronounced them in the country illegally. Individuals and whole families went into hiding. The children of these immigrants became vulnerable and prime victims for LA street gangs, the Bloods, and the Crips. But in the 1990s, alienated Salvadoran youth formed their own gangs for protection. Mara Salvatrucha, better known as MS-13, and the 18th Street Gang were soon surviving and thriving in LA by stealing and extortion and the escalation of violence. LA police mounted a counterattack. With the help of U.S. immigration officials, thousands of undocumented gang members were deported back to Central America. By then, those returning to their homelands were wired to the gang life. Their motto: mata, roba, viola, controla. Kill, steal, rape, and control.
I heard the door open. I went out and I saw 4 men coming in. So all of a sudden, they all just pulled guns.
Today, Sai Jimenez lives in hiding in Central America. We agreed not to show his face or use his real name to protect his safety. In 2005, Sai was 10 years old, living with his mom, dad, and 8-year-old sister in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. His older brother was living in the U.S. Sai's father owned a small business in the MS-13 gang-controlled neighborhood. The attackers belonged to a rival gang. That night, Sai witnessed the sexual abuse of his mother.
And they tied us up. My mom was beside of me, and she cried the whole time. And I saw all that. I was 10 when that happened. I was mad how they treated us, how they touched my mom. For everything they did, I was furious because I couldn't do anything.
2 years later, when he was 12, he got a chance for revenge. He and a friend identified the gunmen. MS-13 gang members took the boys under their protection, which put them in further risk.
We were at the market eating, and we saw 2 men coming. And I saw the gun coming out, so we started running because we saw the guns, and then he started shooting at us. I got shot 3 times.
Sai made it to a friend's house. The mother was a nurse.
The bullet was right here. She cut right here, and she tried to get it over here. Then the bullet moved right here, and then she had to cut again.
Patched up but still in pain, Sai went back to the market to look for his friend. Chico was dead.
The same day I left, I went to the house. I got so scared. I told my mom that I needed to leave the country and they needed to move.
Sai had to make the 180-mile journey north to cross from Honduras into Guatemala, where he would catch a train. It took him almost 2 weeks. Desperation set in.
I was 12 and a half, and I had to go steal so I could leave. So shamingly, I took a lady's old purse and dropped her to the ground. But I felt bad because she could have been my mom. But I needed money. I need to run. I need to get out of here.
He made it across the border to Guatemala.
And I was like, I'm in a different country. I got no money and got no help. I called him my brother. Never called him before. He was in Texas. He told me, what the hell are you doing there, boy? So he sent me $100.
Starting in the late 1990s, Central Americans heading north to the U.S. would board La Bestia, the Beast, and travel for days by rail. It was dangerous. Many died falling from the train. Many more were maimed in accidents. The train was under control of gangs and drug cartels. They extorted money from those who wanted to board.
We were in the train like for 24 hours. Got to the nearest town, and that's how we kept on going. In Veracruz, I called my mom, and I told her where I was because I was worried. She was, son, I'm glad you're okay. Where you been? She was so worried. She didn't know what to say, but I didn't have enough money to, I think I only had like 1 minute or two to tell her that I loved her, that I was fine, to not worry about me, that I was going to the States, and I needed money. And she sent me $200.
2 weeks later, he made it to the U.S.-Mexico border. The traffickers demanded more than $1,500 to cross by foot. He called his brother again.
And I told him, I'm at the border, and I need your help. And he was like, right now I can't help you, bro. I don't have no money. So I had no other choice to work. But where was I was gonna work where I didn't know nobody at the border?
It took almost 6 months to earn the $1,500 needed to pay the cartel for safe passage.
We started like at 6. Once the sun gets down, we started walking all night long.
Now in the U.S., Cy's much older brother, who he had never met in person, came to pick him up.
I felt wonderful. I felt safe. So when I got there, I felt that I have conquered something, that I made it, that I did it. I was carrying the world, and I dropped it.
For the next 8 years, Cy made a life for himself in the U.S. When he was 17, he met the woman who would become his wife.
She was good. She taught me English. She was a country girl.
They moved to West Virginia to be near her family. They married and had a son.
We had a kid, Xavier. He was born the day after Christmas.
2 more children followed, but Cy was undocumented and still feared deportation. He bonded with his father-in-law.
Her dad is a police officer from Chesapeake. But he's cool. He's like a hippie.
And he knew you were not in the country legally, but he
didn't care.
The couple settled in a small coal mining town in Whitesville.
At first, I was the only Hispanic probably in the whole town. Like, there's only whites. Like, their name is White. So whenever you see somebody like my color, my height, they stare a lot, they talk. But once you show them that you mean good, they respect you.
But it was more than respect. Cy became part of the closely knit town of just over 500 people. He was active in the Baptist church. He joined the volunteer fire department. He became especially close to his wife's grandfather.
Eddie Weber, it was like my dad to me. That was her grandpa. He taught me how to fish. He taught me hunting. He shooting. He was a no good countryman and very good to his woman.
Now, learning to hunt in the rural forests of West Virginia would become a real cruel twist to Cy's story. He had applied for asylum in the U.S., he had an American wife and 3 American-born children, and had left a deadly situation back in Honduras. But 2 weeks before the hearing, he was target practicing, and a neighbor called the police, not knowing it was Cy. Immigration officials discovered he was in the country illegally and had already been deported once when he was 12 years old. He was charged with illegal possession of a weapon and having known gang ties in Honduras. He was ordered deported. But the town would not let him go quietly. More than 300 of the 500 people living in Whitesville, West Virginia, signed a petition to allow him to stay.
I feel good. I feel love. I never thought that I would get too many signatures and so many letters to the judges saying that I was good.
It has been 3 years since Cy was deported. Under the Trump administration, if he's caught in the U.S. again illegally, he could spend up to 20 years in prison. He says he is living with half a heart, away from his wife and his children.
They rip half of your life away. It's like they just take it and you die and you're somewhere else. You're in the most dangerous country in the world, in hell. You get shot for nothing, just for looking at somebody wrong here.
Cy is struggling to maintain his ties to his family.
I talk to my children twice a week, Skype. You know what I mean? I feel bad because when I talk to them, they're like, "Daddy, you don't love me, why you're not here?" Because they're too young to realize, you know what I mean?
He has come to terms with the fact that he broke U.S. laws, but is hoping someday he can return.
We're humans. We all make mistakes. And if I made my mistakes, I'm not perfect or anything. We all deserve a second chance.
The story of Cy Jimenez is like many other immigrants who leave home looking for that second chance. Through his story, we can see that U.S. political policies and also natural disasters have impacts beyond our borders that can last for decades. That's our show, but here's an important programming note. In January, we're launching a new public affairs show, Arizona 360. We hope you'll tune in. I'm Nancy Montoya. Thanks for joining us on this special edition of Arizona Week.